Sorry about that. I just realized my microphone wasn't plugged in and we were running off some other crazy ones, so hopefully everything makes sense. Um, if not, as this thing is still trying to build and not crash on me, um, quick recap of what we've looked at so far. We've just added a new project, added our model for movie, and then added our pages, or inside of our pages folder, added a movies folder, and tried to scaffold, and that's where we still sit at this point. Um, and this is not looking promising. So I'll give it another minute and then just kill it and restart it if need be. Get rid of that. Right, so we're going to do an Alt F4. Try and get out of Visual Studio. Restart the program. Man, we've had such good luck up until today. Recover the files, and we'll see where we're at. Alright, so we're going to try this again. And once the whole thing loads out, because clearly we're struggling. That project. Try and keep this lighter weight. New scaffold item. CRUD. Outer context, hit add, and cross our fingers and hope this actually loads. There we go. Whew. Got worried it was going to crash on us again. Alright, so once again, we have all these crazy pages that got created, so let's actually dive into them and take a look real quick, and then we'll move on. So the first one we have is create. Obviously, this would be to allow us to create a new record on the website. Couple key things to keep track of on here, and I'm going to be jumping all around, so bear with me. So like I talked about when we first jumped into .NET Core, we're looking at something called Razor Pages, and they're derived from something called the page model. By convention, the page model is a derived class, and the constructor uses dependency injection, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, so don't worry about it too much right now, but it allows us to add Razor Page context to pages, and it allows us to inject services and libraries throughout the code, and more importantly, with page model, it allows us to use asynchronous coding. Asynchronous coding and everything like that you can get into and read a ton of it online. It's kind of the new standard. The idea is really, in old school programming, we ran in a straight line, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. Asynchronous coding allows us to maybe call a function on step 1, and then step 2 can also be running, and we can start having some stuff running in parallel. And it's asynchronous callbacks, so things can still run on the page while we're waiting for a return object. For this class, really just understand everything's going to be async, and because of that, you're going to have to use stuff called awaits to kind of pause it to allow the callback to come back. It's kind of the standard flow for new web code. If you're really interested in parallel programming, it is a way more complex and deeper subject, and I'm nowhere near going to jump into that. But feel free to research it. You can definitely look up asynchronous programming within the framework, and there's some great Microsoft documentation out there about it if you really want to dive into the topic more. But for this, if we expand this out, we look at create.cshtml. When a request is made for the page, the onGet async, which this one is not asynced, is this one? Did mine not create async calls today? OnGet async. All right, so I'll look at, actually I think index does it really nice and way cleaner. There we go. So if we look at our index.cshtml.cs file, under our movies folder, we have this. Public async task, onGet async. So the onGet async or onGet is called to initialize the state of the page. Think about it like our init, I think it was like the init initializer function that we had on web forms. Same kind of thing. In this case, this is going to get us a list of movies. What we can see here, and again, I'm moving all over the place, so bear with it. And the first thing we can see on line 22 is it's called public iList movie movies. iList is a interface list, right? So interfaces are part of the object-oriented hierarchy. Interfaces allow you to have multiple classes that inherit from the interface, and the interface is your public endpoint into those classes. So these all inherit from what's called IEnumerables and collections general. The iList is one of the most common ones you're going to use, and or hard-coded list objects. Lists and iList and IEnumerables are all fancy ways of using things better than an array. Because if you think back to an array, and I'm going to high level this, next week we'll look at this more, but I get sidetracked really easily. The idea is with the iList, we can, instead of having it be an array where it's an index and a value, lists and IEnumerables allow us to inject models. They allow us to inject actual class objects in and be able to have a collection of them. So instead of it just being an array with an index 1 or 0 and a value, now I can have a list of movies, and inside of that, each one is an entire movie object. And our movie object is obviously, if we hit F12, that is our class that we design, right? ID, title, release date, genre, price. So now we can have a whole list of these things. So then on our onGet async call, all we're doing is saying, hey, this thing called movie, this property we have on the page, go get from the context, where context represents the database, get the table called movie, and put all of it to the list asynchronously. And with the await, it'll then wait to do anything else until this callback comes back completed. This allows us to go in one line, go get every possible movie and add them to a list so we can iterate and do anything we want on the front end. So then the question becomes, what are we doing on the front end? In this, we can see we have a table. So now we're on the index CS.html. We have a table, and then we set it up with table rows. So we have display name for model. So now we're getting into some Razor syntax. Razor syntax is the best. It's way nicer than web forms. It's way easier to write and inject C# and Razor syntax, which is this hybrid-y thing, into an HTML page. So if we look at this, all the way at the top, we have @page, right? So Razor can transition from HTML into C# or Razor-specific markup with the @ symbol. And then if it's followed by a Razor-reserved keyword, page, model, HTML, those are Razor-specific keywords, and they allow that syntax to do something for us. So in this case, the @page just dictates there is a page backing this. And then we have @model. @model allows us to say, hey, this page references this model class. And in this case, it's the index model. An index model lives over here. We have this public class declaration, and here's all the stuff that it can do. So now from our front end, we can now access anything that's inside of the index model by referencing model, right? That's what that app model allows us to do. That's why we can do something like what we have on line 17, where we say model.movie 0, so whatever's that index 0 dot title. This is a lambda expression. This model equal caret model.movie.title, that's a lambda expression. We're going to look at those in depth next week because lambda will appear everywhere in the .NET Core and MVC world and anywhere outside of web forms. Lambda is super powerful. It's a short, handy way to access things. You will use it and learn it and not be scared of it at some point in your coding career. So we have that. We have view data. So the view data, this thing right here, view data is a fancy array, is the best way to explain it. So normally an array, right, if we go back to our world of arrays, you had the ability to do access a set of value to a specific index, normally by a numeric, right? So you could say array string, or let's say our array is array 1, and you could have array 1 brackets 2 equals something. And then if there was whatever the third element of the array was, you could set the value. View data works similarly, but in a looser concept. So view data allows us to, it's global across your website. It allows you to pass a value in and dictate what the index is going to be called. So in this case, we're using this view data to pass the title of the page around. So every page would pass view data title equal to something, and it'll get into the view data array. And then if we jump over to our shared layout, you can see this line on line 6. And so what line 6 is with that at view data, again, raise your syntax into view data, we're now just going to pull whatever that value was out that got passed from each of our pages and attach it to the title of the page. It's super cool, but also risky because if you use title with, where'd I go? If you use title like this and then accidentally on a different page you use all lowercase title, those are different elements. So spelling, grammar, and capitalization matters if you're going to try and share stuff across the board. Really only recommend it in cases like this where you're trying to get something to the layout and it's pretty generic. It is not the correct way to pass data from page to page to page. It is a workaround in some cases, but it is not the ideal way. You should always be passing that back through the back end and then resurface it on the front end so it's secure. But that's what the view data is. Is that over here? So another thing that we may come across is normally these are HTML comments, right? We've all seen this before. If you've done any HTML work, you use the caret with the exclamation, double dash, and then you can put some comments in. And those actually surface on the front end, right? Like if I view the source of a web page on the front end, I can see those comments. If you do @star, what I just wrote on line 10, these are razor comments. Razor comments are special because they don't actually make it to the front end. They won't get rendered at all. They are strictly there for you to be able to see while you're coding. But, and when we run this code in a little bit, we can look at it again. These will not show up. They will not be in the view source. They won't be in the dev console. They won't be anywhere. They do not get rendered all the way there. Why is that important? Well, at the end of the day, it probably won't matter too much because comments on front-end pages, I'm indifferent to. But on the off chance you're trying to comment stuff out and just leave notes to future programmers or whatever, if you do it this way, then it won't give anything away to someone that is trying to be malicious or just trying to steal your code from you. You can have hidden comments to yourself that only if you have raw code could you actually see. So before we go any farther, we need to do one thing. If you remember last week when we created our database, we had to do something called add the migration and update the database, right? So we need to do the same thing. So we can do add migration. Again, this is in our package manager console. We're going to do add migration and create movie table. Obviously, that doesn't get us very far. So before we do that, we need to go to data and our week 8 demo and make sure that's there. And then also in startup, where's my startup CS file? Okay, so we add our razor pages, we do build, if it's dev. So what? Oh, there we go. Default project, week 8 demo. So if you're following with my silly choices, make sure in your package manager console you've changed your default project to the week 8 demo. Then if we try and do an add migration, now to run. Ooh, it's been a while. So once we do an add migration, you'll notice some crazy stuff. But more importantly, something I want to touch on is what we're doing with our add migration command. Now, I know I touched on it a little bit last week, but as a reminder, make sure you add your dashes in the right spots, and you can use tab to help autocomplete in the console. More importantly, what you're putting here, where I put create underscore movie underscore table, is what the migration is called. If we look in our migrations folder, we can see after the date timestamp, we can see it. So I really recommend picking a naming convention and sticking to it when you're working on a project. And for me, where do I want to put this? I want to put this on the data context. So for my personal choice, when I'm doing stuff, what I like to do, so for my migration patterns, the first thing I'll put is what the change is. So, and what I mean by that is it a create, an update, or delete? So am I creating a new table? Am I updating a table? Am I deleting a table? And if you're doing multiple, I still would add them all. So then, what table are you modifying? So this would just be the table name. And in this case, I did underscore it out one more time with table, just to be very clear what I'm doing to myself and for this. But this would then turn into something like, so what I mean by that is, and this is why it's there, like for this, it was a table creation, so I just put table creation. But is it a change column? What column are you changing if you're updating a table? What column are you deleting? What is it, a property on the tables? So then your messages can become something like update movie alter, let's say we alter release date or alter title to null or something like that. So there we can say, hey, right away we know we updated something. Then you can see immediately what table got updated, and if there's multiple, you can smash them together. Then for me, I just said, hey, I altered the title column and I changed it to null. So immediately when I would see that migration name, I know what was happening without having to click into it. And when you have multiple developers working on a project together and we all can see the migrations, it's really important so we understand who's doing what to the database, because all of us are going to be leveraging that database to access the data for the website. So I really recommend picking a pattern, sticking to it, and if nothing else, put a comment in the TB context file of migration pattern and explain it so anyone else that touches your code can understand what it means. So now that we've added a migration, now remember we got to do an update database. So we'll do update database command and let that run. Again, if you're running into a weird error on the package manager console, first thing, make sure week 8 demo or whatever your project name you're working on is selected as the default project, or it'll freak out. Here I can, if I scroll through real quick, it looks like everything created. Now if I go ahead and run my project, because we haven't done that yet, let's take a look at what we can see. So bring this guy across. And if I go into my URL and do a /movies, this should route us to our new movie index, which we can see. Now, if we hit create new, this is one of those pages we scaffolded out. Now I can say, let's add a title, Robin Hood. I don't know when it got released. I know it was way back in the day. So we'll say it was 97 July. That's great. Genre, animation, price $9.99, and we can hit create. Now, right away when we hit that create, we did some stuff in the background, and we'll take a look at that. But now we can see that we actually have something showing up in our list, and we could keep adding. So let's say this one got released last week. Because again, I just want to get some data in there real quick so we have stuff to look at. So if we snap this and not that one, that goes over here still, and we snap that just real quick so we can look at them side by side. If we look at our index CS HTML CS, now we can see we have this table, right? So over here we have these table headers, and we can see them right here. Now obviously this isn't the prettiest looking thing, right? Release date, really we want that human readable, so we probably want release space date. Next week we'll take a look at ways we can do that. One way is really just to eliminate this display for and just change it ourselves. So if I do a Control KC, which is comment out, then we can say release date. If I save, I can do a refresh, and it won't take because it's not built. But we'll see that when we rebuild. We can see our genre and our price, that's all happy. And then we have a for each loop for every item in the model.movie, which remember .movie is a list of objects. We can then loop through and spit some stuff out, which we're doing with the title, the release date, the animation, or the genre, and the price. Then we have this last column, which is a bunch of ASPH pages, right? So that A, if you know your HTML, that's your anchor tag. And then we have a page that it's going to route to, which is /edit. So that's a, wow, I'm blanking on it. It's loosely coupled routing. So instead of actually having to do the full link of HTTPS, all that, you can just say, hey, go out a folder. It's in the same folder. We're looking for the page called edit, which we know if we look at our Solution Explorer. Wow, Let me get that where it belongs. So if we look at our pages, movies, we know there's something called .edit. We have one called details, and we have one called delete. And then we have this ASP route ID at item.id. Remember, our ID is the ID and the primary key of our record. And so this allows us to pass the ID across. So if I hit edit, right? Now if we expand this out, we can see up here in the URL, we are now at edit with a question mark, ID equals 1. That is the routing. So in Visual Studio, right? So obviously all that gives us is our edit ability to edit the record. Nothing too crazy there. But if we look at the edit page, we can see a whole lot of stuff. We'll look at this a little bit next week. Since we're already getting a little sidetracked, we'll look at some of this. But you have a label, you have an input. We're going to look at Razor syntax more in a couple weeks, not next week, because that's Lincoln Lambda. And we'll talk about what all this stuff means, but we can understand there's a validation, there's a label, there's an input box, and all of that fun stuff. But what I really want to look at is the CS side. So here we can see onGetAsync is a nullable ID. So in the event that we don't pass an ID through, we can then return a not found, which would be a 404 error. Otherwise, if a number comes through so ID is not null and the context is not null, we can do so then we get the movie. If movie is null, so here we're looking at the context.movie, first or default async, which is another built-in function of ND framework to cycle through the movies. We'll look at that next week because we got some more Lambda tied there. If it's not found, so if movie comes back null, we'll 404. Otherwise, we'll pass movie in. And then it'll populate the page based on all of the Razor syntax on the front end. All of this just allows us to pass something in and do some work for it. So now let's say we want to change this to children's movie, because maybe that's a better genre, maybe we're reclassifying our movies. We can do that. So then we can hit save, and it'll kick us back over, and we can see that it changed. So right away, just by adding a model, doing a migration, and doing some scaffolding, we can now create, edit, modify. We can delete, which I'm not going to do right now since we only have 2 records. And we can click on details, which just gives us a nice little read-only view of the data. You can do back to this. We have a fully functioning CRUD website where you could add, modify, delete, and create new data into a database. Super easy. Hopefully you realize how much cleaner this is than what we are doing with having to create a whole SQL Server thing and all of that. That all can go away because of ND framework. Couple pieces to this. This is great, right? Because now we created a table, we're all happy. What happens if we realize, hey, we forgot we need to do the rating, right? We need the rating for this page. Sorry, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything else I wanted to mention today. Okay, so I'm going to minimize that for right now. I'm going to stop the build, just so it's out of my way. So out of our build, couple things. What if we want to look at our database, right? Because now we added some stuff, we want to see it. You can select your SQL Server Object Explorer tab. Maybe you need to pull it out from View or Tools, wherever it's hiding. View, SQL Server. It's not there. View, SQL Server Object Explorer. I already have my pins, so I can pull it down. Now I gotta just find should be this guy. Databases. Cool. So now in your SQL Server Object Explorer, there should be a local DB, MS SQL, local DB, SQL Server, whatever version you're running. It should be 13, hopefully. And I can see my week 8 demo.data. And in here, I can see my external tables, And now I can see my migration history one, and I can double click and view my movie one. So what's going on here versus what we had before? Now we're using what's called LocalDB, and it's a lightweight version of SQL Server Express database engine, which is just a fancy database engine that you used to use, that's targeted for program development. It starts on demand, runs in the user mode, so there's no extra configs, no MDF files you have to do, because by default, LocalDB database creates the MDF file in your user's user directory, and it'll just sit there. It's not part of the solution like it was when we were doing web forms. This is super important because this allows developers to leverage GitHub, right? Because you remember, when we were doing the SQL Server stuff, I couldn't see your MDFs because by default, Git doesn't want you to post MDF files to Git repos because they're going to be big, they're going to be bulky. The idea is to be using, with GitHub, you're going to use MD Framework or some other thing, or you're going to be connecting to a legitimate SQL Server instance most likely. But either way, you're not going to be passing MDFs around. So we can view it, but when you submit this .NET Core project and there's a database tied to it, I have to physically add migrations and update to the database myself to actually build the MDF locally so I can see what's going on, which is super nice. But think about what that means. That means if you access this code from Git, you pulled it down, cloned a repo, all of that, and tried to run it, you wouldn't be able to see the data, right? The data wouldn't exist anymore because it's local to my PC. So what do we do to get around that? And the way we do that is what's called seeding the database. So what seeding the database means, if we go back to Solution Explorer, seeding the database is a class that you'll create and you'll tie it to the DB context, and it will, on initial load of the application, if there's nothing in the database, it will auto run this code to populate the database for you. So in an instance where every developer is running locally, or for assignments like this, once there's a seed file set up, I can rebuild the database with the default data set and be able to immediately start development based on some level of data. Obviously, in a long-term project and a more expansive project with a huge database, seeds are really not the ideal way. Most likely you'll connect to a server and have a server database, and we'll look at that here with what happens when we modify and there's data in the database. But for right now, let's create a seed file. So what we're going to do, for my sake, I like to keep it in the data folder since that's where the database context also lives. We're going to add a new class, and we can call it seed data. So now we have a public class seed data. What we're going to do, and I'm going to paste a bunch of code in, and then we can talk through it. I think it's all this. Let's see. Actually, I'll leave that like that so we can look at it better. Okay, so what in the heck did I just paste in? First, it's called the initializer, or in this case, the initialize function. It takes in an iService provider, service provider, which I'm not gonna jump into what that actually means. That's way more time than I have. But then we have a using statement. Using the context, new week 8 demo context, get the required service. So all this is doing is saying, hey, from the program.cs file where we've registered a service called week 8 demo context that uses our connection string, so our database connection, right? So using that, look to see if there's any movies. Has there been anything added? Has there been anything in there? If there has, that means you have data. We don't care anymore. Just return, get out, because it's been seeded or you've already touched it, so we don't care. Otherwise, you're going to do an add range, which is just like when we add any kind of range, we're just going to add a whole bunch of stuff, which would be a array of movies. So it's a movie array, so it's a bunch of movies. And there we can see, and this was just pasted in, we have the title, release date, the genre, and the price. And we have a few of them ready to go. I think I have... wasn't enough, so I need to add a couple more. And I will paste, or I will have this class available on Blackboard so you guys can just paste it in as well. If you want to hand type it, great, but normally, even in my actual career, I would normally just have found a generic template and then paste it in because I don't like seeds very often. They're a little messy. So now we have this class, right? Now, in the program CS file, we need to actually have it do something. So after the app is built, before we're going to check for our request pipeline, we're going to add up some lines of code. We're going to do a using. Is this already in there somewhere? No. Interesting. Okay. Let's see if this works. I don't think I need this. Sorry, it's been a minute since I've... I wonder if I can just do this. Uh-oh. There we go. Uh-oh. Yeah, that looks... Is this one gonna work? Sorry, I honestly have not done this in forever, so I'm kind of doing this on the fly. That works great for identity stuff, but... That's what it was. Okay. So what we're going to do, they've drastically changed seeding since I last did a seed. I'm going to add some bunch of extra code. We're going to see if this works, and then I'll just paste it in. This does not feel correct at all, to be honest. This feels way more expansive than it should be. Yeah, this is crazy weird. I don't like this either. Alright, so we did that, and then oh man. They totally changed this in EF core, didn't they? Okay. Well, since I am way out of touch on how to do this properly, we're going to leave it at having our seed database class there, and I will show you guys the code next week on how to do it, because I got to do some digging to see what they changed, because they changed some stuff, which is super crazy. I haven't done a seeding database in forever because that's just not really the standard. Normally we have a database we're building off of with a bunch of data, but the idea is with a seed method like this, we would force the app to actually initialize this if there's nothing in our database. For any of our examples, if that's the case, I'll figure out a workaround if I don't show you better code, and I'll try and post something this week if I can find it. But once this is there, this allows us to start doing something, and what that something is just dependent, right? So the last thing we're going to touch on, which I know this one's getting really long, the last thing I want to talk about is doing modifications. So like I talked about, what happens if in our model, right, we decide, hey, we need something else. We need public string rating, right? We need the rating of the movies. It's not much help to have a database of movies without the rating. And 100% we could just add this in, and once it's there, I'm sure if we look, nothing's really mad at us yet, but obviously now the rating is going to be on the model, but it's not actually going to be visible to any of the pages. So then we would actually have to go into each page and say, hey, we need to update this. So I would actually probably duplicate this guy because it's a string. Right, so I can do a control, I can highlight a bunch, and now we need to say movie.rating. And for each independent page, we would need to go in and make sure it's going to be visible. So everywhere we reference movie, we would need to do a movie.rating. So on the create, the delete, the details, and then also on the back end, we would need to add that in. Now, that's great, but what happens now? So I'm going to add it one more place on the index just so we can see what happens. So if I do this, oh, there it is. And then we're going to add another header. I'm just going to do that. And then if I spin this up, let's see what happens. So pull this guy back across. And if I do /movies, SQL exception, invalid column rating. Why did it yell at us for this? It yelled at us because we changed our model, right? We changed our model. We said, hey, we want to have ratings. We didn't update our database. So when we tried to get our async list on our index page, right? When it's our index.cs.html, actually it's our backend page. Remember when we tried to do this? This aired out because context doesn't know what rating means. So it can't map anything there, and it thinks it should. So how do you fix it? Hopefully the answer is obvious. We just add migration. So we add migration, rating, right? Add migration, update, underscore movie, add column, rating. We'll do an add migration. We'll do an update database. Now, if we try and run this, right, so now we've added the column on, what would we expect to have happen? Definitely should have changed default routing on this, but we'll look at that next week too. So we'll go back to our movies homepage. If your guess was everything goes away, good try. Thankfully, no. So with ND Framework, when you do an add migration and create an update database, it will not destroy anything. If there's data in the database already, it will not touch it. It will just alter the column, which, interesting enough, will allow it to actually have a null value on existing data. But we know that our column is actually is not nullable. So if we go to edit this, well, that's no help, right? Notice how it's not letting us save, but it's not throwing an error. And the reason it's not throwing an error is because we don't have rating on there. But what would happen is because now rating is a value that needs to be filled out, we can't modify our data set until we add that required column in. So obviously really bad when we don't have it on the page. But anything moving forward would have that rating option that needs to be filled in as part of the requirements. So all of your old data hasn't been touched and modified in any way, but anytime someone tries to modify or do anything with it moving forward, it would cause a problem. So the recommendation, and normally this shouldn't happen too often, you would just have to go update the existing test data, because remember, this is all during development when these things don't matter. In my experience, anytime we've added a column, we always make sure it's nullable for the release if it's an alteration to an existing table, because we don't want to break the entire site with millions of records because we added some new required column. And we'll work around that by adding lots of validation on the front end that would prevent the user from moving forward but wouldn't force it to break on certain displays. And it really depends case specific what the right answer is, but it is something to keep in mind. So because we made a not nullable column, right, it's nullable false, it has to have a value when we edit it, but it didn't delete it. Now there are some other ways when you alter, let me see if I can find that in this. Oh my goodness. So there are some things where normally this is the way you do it, because you don't lose anything, you can move forward. There is a way, I don't recommend it, I've never really taken advantage of it, but you could always use any framework you can drop and recreate the whole database using the new model class schema. Not really worth it, because then you would lose any of your seeded data, any of the data you've already run tests through, anything that other developers are working on when they pulled up your project. It would just break a lot of stuff. So it's not really ideal, but early on, it's a potential way to do it. You could explicitly modify the schema on the server. I guess that's a good option, but that defeats some of the power behind any framework. There are cases where you would have to do that, but for a dev project like this where you're spinning everything up net new, so it's all brand new database, new web page, all of that, there's no reason to do that. We do code first, which is what we just did here, right? So with the code first migration, we were able to add a migration, update the database, and we don't lose anything. The continuity is still there. Then your developer team, if you have other people working on the project, all they have to do is also run the update database command when they pick up the code, and they're off and running. So by updating it, you're golden. Now what we would need to do is in our seed class, wherever that is hiding, with seed, we would need to update that to also represent that new column. And you should be off and running with some stuff. Hopefully that all made sense. I know there was a ton of stuff and I sped through some stuff and bypassed some stuff, but hopefully all of this kind of makes sense and you can once again just realize the power of ND Framework and why it is such a cool tool moving forward to do web dev, and also how cool scaffolding is to immediately give you 80% of work because everything is already tied together. You had the list, you had the create, the edit, the delete. It was all right there ready to go for you, and you could start adding data in immediately. So with that, next week we're going to be looking at link, lambda, and validation and data annotations and how that all comes together with ND Framework, especially with how to modify some stuff easier, and also how to force validations using the dry concept, which is don't repeat yourself. And then we'll look at putting all of this together with some front end stuff and just keep moving forward to a point where we can build a super cool site and collectively build something out across a repo with multiple people together, because that's kind of the culmination of where we're going to get to, especially with GitHub. I want us to take advantage of that idea of all of us working on a website together, and then we'll get into the final project. So we're coming down the stretch, but we still have a lot of cool concepts coming and a lot of heavy material, so good luck. Make sure to check the assignment and make sure to get it turned in on time. With that, we'll talk next week.